Imagine you're the captain of a starship. You've lost people, good people. Now imagine you could go back. Not to save them. That's impossible. But to try again. To find a version of the mission where they don't die. Where you don't die. And then imagine you've done this so many times that you've forgotten which version of yourself is the real one. This is Captain Sloane's problem. She has 7 versions of her ship, 17 versions of her crew, and only one shot at the truth. The hull of the Odysseus groaned like a dying animal. Captain Mira Sloane felt it through the soles of her boots, a deep, resonant shiver that traveled up her spine and settled behind her ribs. She'd heard that sound before, on Timeline 4. The port stabilizer had sheared off exactly 47 seconds before the reactor went critical. She blinked. No, that was Timeline 6. She pressed her palm against the bulkhead. The metal was cold, then warm, then cold again. The ship's AI, a quietly sarcastic entity named Penelope, had flagged 17 minor systems anomalies in the last 6 minutes. Sloane had stopped reporting them. What was the point? The other Sloanes already knew. Captain, she turned. Ensign Park stood in the corridor, a datapad clutched to his chest like a religious artifact. He was 23 years old. He had kind eyes and a habit of humming old Earth sea shanties when he thought no one was listening. He died in Timeline 2, a hull breach during an atmospheric skirmish. Sloane had watched his body tumble into the void, his mouth open in a silent scream she still heard sometimes when the ship's life support cycled into its quiet phase. Ensign, she said. Her voice was steady. It always was. That was the problem. The quantum entanglement array is acting up again. He held out the datapad. We're getting signal echoes. Multiple sources. All with our encryption. Sloane didn't take the pad. She already knew what it said. The other her had been trying to make contact for 3 weeks now. Timeline 11 Sloane had figured out how to punch a message through the causal barrier first. She was always the clever one. Then Timeline 3 Sloane had followed. Then Timeline 9. Now they were all shouting into the dark. A choir of identical voices singing slightly different harmonies. Route it to my quarters, she said. And Park? Sir. Stop humming, leave her, Johnny. It's bad luck. His eyes widened. He hadn't realized anyone had noticed. That was the thing about Sloane. She noticed everything. After 37 timelines, she'd memorized the micro-expressions of every crew member. The way Chief Mbeki tapped his ring against his coffee mug when he was nervous. The way Lieutenant Voss blinked twice before lying. She knew them better than they knew themselves. And she'd buried most of them, sometimes twice. She walked to her quarters, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The Odysseus was a heavy cruiser, built for a crew of 200. She had 47. The rest were ghosts, not literal ones, but close enough. Their bunks were still made. Their personal effects still sat in their lockers. Sloane hadn't had the heart to clear them out. Every timeline, she told herself she would. Every timeline, she didn't. Her quarters were small, cluttered with handwritten notes stuck to every surface. The notes were a memory. After Timeline 12, the temporal dissonance had started to blur her recollections. She'd wake up unsure which version of the mission she was living. So she'd started writing things down. Timeline 4. Park dies at 1432. Don't open the ventral airlock. Timeline 7. Becky's hand. The left one. Watch for the tremor. She sat at her desk and activated the quantum array. The screen flickered, then resolved into 7 separate windows, each showing the face of a woman who looked exactly like her. Some were older. Timeline 1 Sloane had gray streaking her temples and deep lines around her eyes. Timeline 17 Sloane was younger, sharper, her movements more aggressive. She'd only been at this for a few months. The naivety still showed. You're late, said Timeline 11. She was the de facto leader of the collective. Not because she was the original. No one knew who that was anymore, but because she'd figured out the communication protocol first. That gave her a certain authority. I was talking to Park, Sloane said. A ripple of something passed through the other versions. Pain, recognition. They all had their Parks. Their own versions of the ensign who hummed sea shanties. Some had saved him. Some hadn't. We have a problem, said Timeline 3. Her voice was hoarse. She'd been screaming at a void for 3 days in her timeline, trying to get the attention of a creature that fed on entropy. The convergence is accelerating. I'm getting bleed through from 4 other versions. My Park just asked me why I was crying. I wasn't crying. One of you was. Sloane felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The convergence. That was the word they coined for what was happening. The timelines were starting to collapse into each other, drawn together by the sheer weight of their own contradictions. Too many Sloanes making too many different choices. The universe wasn't built to handle that kind of paradox. How long? She asked. Days, said Timeline 11. Maybe hours. We need to choose a prime timeline and collapse the others into it. It's the only way to stabilize the causal loop. Choose which one? Asked Timeline 17. Her voice was tight. She was young. She still thought there was a right answer. Silence. They'd known this moment was coming. For weeks, months in some timelines, they'd been dancing around it. None of them wanted to be the version that got erased. None of them wanted to admit that most of them were going to cease to exist. Their memories, their experiences, their people, all of it gone, absorbed into a single thread of reality. There's another option, Sloane said. 7 pairs of identical eyes turned to her. 7 identical frowns. There's always another option, said Timeline 11, but there was something in her voice. Hope. She'd learned to hate hope. It was the most painful emotion because it always led to disappointment. The entity, Sloane said. The one from Timeline 3's void. It feeds on entropy, right? On divergence. It feeds on difference, Timeline 3 corrected. On the energy released when 2 possible states collapse into one. It's why it's been following us. We're the biggest source of difference in the galaxy. Then, let's give it what it wants, Sloane said. All of it. At once. She saw the realization dawn on their faces. Timeline 17 got there first. Her eyes widened. You want to trigger the convergence intentionally. Weaponize it. I want to open a rift so wide that the entity has to choose, Sloane said. Either it consumes the divergence and stabilizes all our timelines, or it gets overwhelmed and collapses into a singular state itself. Either way, we stop the bleed. That's insane, said Timeline 1. She rarely spoke. She was the oldest, the weariest. She'd seen more death than any of them. We don't know what happens to us in that scenario. We could all be erased. We're going to be erased anyway, Sloane said quietly. At least this way, we choose how. Another silence. This one was heavier. It carried the weight of 37 timelines, of countless deaths, of every version of Park who'd ever floated into the void. Sloane looked at her own reflection in the dark parts of the screen. She looked tired. She looked old. She looked like someone who had run out of room for more grief. I'll need help, she said. From all of you. We have to synchronize our quantum arrays perfectly. 1 millisecond off, and the rift collapses inward instead of outward. And if it works? Asked Timeline 9. She was the optimist. It had gotten her crew killed 3 times. Sloane allowed herself a small, tired smile. Then we all get to keep living. Different lives. Different timelines. No more bleed through. No more watching each other die. And the entity? Asked Timeline 3. It gets fed, Sloane said. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it leaves. Or maybe it stays, and we just made a very powerful friend. Timeline 11 was the first to nod. Then Timeline 3. Then one by one the others. Sloane closed her eyes and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for years. The next 12 hours were a blur of activity. Sloane moved through the Odysseus like a woman possessed, her hands flying across control panels, her voice barking orders that made no sense to the crew, but that they followed anyway because she was the captain and because somewhere deep down they trusted her. Even when she asked for things that were impossible. Even when she rewired the main reactor to feed directly into the quantum array. Even when she told Park to evacuate the forward sections and seal the blast doors. Captain, Park said, catching up to her outside engineering. The crew is getting nervous. Lieutenant Voss is asking if we're under attack. Tell her we're not, Sloane said, not slowing down. Tell her we're about to do something much stranger. Which is... She stopped, turned to face him. For a moment, she saw all the other Parks. The one who'd died in Timeline 2, the one she'd saved in Timeline 5 only to watch him go mad from temporal sickness, the one in Timeline 14 who'd held her hand as the ship fell apart around them. This Park, her Park, was still whole, still humming sea shanties, still looking at her with those kind, trusting eyes. We're going to talk to God, she said, and then we're going to ask it to leave us alone. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. That's not what I expected. It never is. She left him there and entered engineering. Chief Mbeki was already at the main console, his fingers dancing across the interface. He'd been with her since Timeline 1. He didn't remember the other timelines. No one did except her, but his body remembered. His left hand had developed a tremor that the doctors couldn't explain. Sloan knew. In Timeline 7, she'd had to cut off that hand to free him from a collapsed bulkhead. The memory had bled through, somehow, etched itself into his nervous system. The modifications are ready, Mbeki said without looking up. But I have to warn you, Captain. This is going to put a strain on the reactor that it wasn't designed for. We're talking about a cascade failure probability of I know the numbers. He finally looked at her. His eyes were dark, thoughtful. He'd been a poet before he'd been an engineer. He still wrote verses in his spare time, little observations about the universe that he never showed anyone. Sloan had read them all. In Timeline 12, she'd found his journal after he'd died. She'd memorized every word. You're not going to tell me what this is really about, are you? He asked. I can't. Because I wouldn't believe you? Because you believe me too quickly, she said. And then you'd be scared. And I need you focused. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded and turned back to the console. The array will be ready in 4 hours. Try not to break the universe before then. No promises. She left engineering and walked to the observation deck. The stars were steady here, untroubled by the temporal distortions that plagued the rest of the ship. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched them. Somewhere out there, in a different timeline, another Sloan was doing the exact same thing. Probably thinking the exact same thoughts. How'd we get here? The answer was simple. She'd been too good at her job. The Odysseus had been sent to investigate a temporal anomaly near the Cygnus arm, a region of space where time moved in loops, repeating the same 7 seconds over and over. Standard procedure was to observe from a distance and report back. But Sloan had seen something in those loops. A pattern, a message, and she'd been curious. Curiosity was a human flaw. It was also their greatest strength. She'd ordered the ship closer. The anomaly had swallowed them whole, spitting them out into 17 different timelines simultaneously. 17 Sloans, 17 crews, 17 versions of the same mission, all diverging from that single moment of contact. She learned later that the anomaly had been a trap, an ancient piece of technology left behind by a species that had wanted to study how primitive minds handled temporal duplication. They'd handled it badly. The first few timelines had been chaos. Sloan had watched herself make every possible mistake. She'd watched herself freeze in combat, watched herself sacrifice the wrong people, watched herself run when she should have fought. And then she'd watched herself learn, adapt, become better. By Timeline 10, she was nearly flawless. By Timeline 15, she was terrifying. By Timeline 20, she'd stopped counting the number of times she'd save her crew because the number was too high and the grief of the ones she'd lost still weighed on her like a physical thing. But the entity had noticed her. Of course it had. She was a walking paradox, a living contradiction. Every time she made a choice that diverged from another timeline, she generated entropy. And the entity was hungry. For hours. She pushed off in a glass and went to work. The synchronization began at 0600 ship time. Sloan sat in the center of the quantum array chamber, a web of fiber optic cables connecting her neural interface to the ship's core. The other Sloans were doing the same, in their own timelines, on their own ships. They'd agreed on a countdown. They'd agreed on a signal. They'd agreed on everything. Except one thing. We have a problem, said Timeline 11's voice in her ear. The communication was tight beam, encrypted, impossible for the crew to intercept. Timeline 5 is offline. Sloan's blood went cold. What do you mean offline? I mean she's not responding. Her quantum signature is fluctuating. Something's wrong. Sloan reached out with her mind, feeling for the thread of Timeline 5. It was there, faint, flickering like a candle in a high wind. But it was also changing, shifting, becoming something else. She's been compromised, Sloan said. The entity is in her timeline. A pause. Then, can we still do this without her? We have to. The countdown continued. 60 seconds. 40. 20. Sloan closed her eyes and felt the other versions of herself reaching out, their consciousnesses brushing against hers like fingers in the dark. She felt Timeline 1's weariness, Timeline 3's grief, Timeline 9's stubborn hope. She felt Timeline 17's fear, sharp and bright and achingly young. And then she felt something else. A presence. Flushed. Old. Hungry. The entity had noticed them. 10 seconds. Now, Sloane whispered. She threw the switch. The quantum array screamed. Light. Not the gentle glow of instrument panels, but something older and angrier filled the chamber. Sloane felt her consciousness tear free of her body, hurtling through a kaleidoscope of possible realities. She saw Timeline 1's ship burning. She saw Timeline 3's crew standing in a circle, their mouths moving in silent prayer. She saw Timeline 17's hands, steady on the controls, even as her face crumbled. And she saw the entity. It had no shape, no form that human eyes could parse. It was a void in the shape of a hunger, a negative space in the fabric of reality that existed only to consume. It had been following her for years, feeding on the crumbs of her divergence. Now she was offering it a feast. All of it, she thought, pushing the words toward it like a gift. Take it all. The entity paused. In that pause, Sloane felt something she hadn't expected. Curiosity. The entity wasn't just hungry. It was interested. It had been following her for so long that it had started to learn her, to understand her, to want more than just the entropy she generated. It wanted to know why she kept trying, why she kept saving them, why she couldn't let go. Because that's what we do, she thought. We don't let go. We don't give up. We fail, and we fail, and we fail, and then we get up and we try again. That's not a flaw. That's the whole point. The entity considered this. Then it did something unexpected. It let go. The rift stabilized. The timelines stopped collapsing. The bleed-through ceased all at once, like a noise that had been playing for so long that Sloane had forgotten it was there until it stopped. She opened her eyes. She was in the quantum array chamber. The lights were normal. The air was still. And, standing in the doorway, looking at her with an expression of profound confusion, was Ensign Park. Captain, he said slowly, I just had the strangest dream. I dreamed that I died. A lot of times. In a lot of different ways. Sloane felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back. It wasn't a dream, she said. Then what was it? She thought about it. About all of it. The 37 timelines. The countless deaths. The entity that had learned to be curious instead of hungry. The other Sloanes, still out there, still living their own lives, no longer bleeding into each other's realities. A memory, she said finally, one we all share now. Park nodded slowly, as if that made perfect sense. Then he started humming. Softly. A sea shanty about leaving a ship behind. Sloane smiled. 3 weeks later, the Odysseus received a message. It came through the quantum array, not as a string of data, but as a direct consciousness-to-consciousness transmission. Sloane was in the middle of her morning coffee when Penelope announced the incoming signal. Captain, you're going to want to see this. Sloane set down her mug and walked to the array chamber. The screen was active, displaying a single word in clean, blocky text. Understand, she stared at it for a long moment. Then, she sat down and typed a response. What do you understand? The reply came almost instantly. The entity was fast. It had always been fast. But now there was something different about its communication. A rhythm. A pattern. It was learning to think like a human. You. Why you fight. Why you grieve. Why you do not stop. And because love is not a logical equation. Because you would rather fail together than succeed alone. Because the trying is the point. Sloane's throat tightened. She thought of Park alive and humming. She thought of Mbeki, his tremor fading now that the timelines had settled. She thought of all the versions of herself that had died so that this version could sit here, drinking bad coffee and talking to a cosmic entity that had just learned what love meant. Yes, she typed. That's exactly right. A long pause. Then, I want to try. Try what? Try what you try. Save. Protect. Hold on. Sloane leaned back in her chair. Outside the viewport, the stars were steady. No distortions. No enormities. Just the quiet, endless dark, waiting to be explored. She thought about the entity. About what it meant to be hungry for so long that you forgot there was any other way to exist. About the loneliness of being a void in the shape of a question with no one to answer. Okay, she typed. But you have to start small. Small how? There's a system 2 light years from here. A planet with a dying star. The inhabitants don't know. They have 6 months left. Go there. Warn them. Don't eat their entropy. Just help. Another pause. Longer this time. That is all. That's enough for now. We can work up to the big stuff later. The screen flickered. For just a moment, Sloane saw something in the static. A shape, almost. Not a face. Not a body. But something with presence. Something that was trying to smile. I will try. The signal ended. Sloane sat in the quiet for a while, finishing her coffee. Then, she stood up and walked to the bridge. Hark was at the helm, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on the navigation interface. He looked up when she entered. Where to, Captain? She thought about it. There were so many places to go, so many things to see, and for the first time in years, she wasn't running from anything. She wasn't trying to fix a mistake or undo a death or save a version of herself that had already been erased. She was just here. Set a course for the Cygnus arm, she said. Slow this time. I want to enjoy the view. Park raised an eyebrow. No more anomalies? No more anomalies. He smiled, that same kind, trusting smile she'd seen in 37 timelines, and turned back to the controls. The engines hummed to life. The stars began to slide past the viewport. And, somewhere in the dark between worlds, a hungry void took its first tentative step toward becoming something else. It started with a single act of kindness. It had to start somewhere.